Hello and welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig Show.
Welcome to one of the internet's best podcasts, where we dive deep into the lives of the extraordinary and fascinating people who leave an indelible mark on our world. Join us as we explore their captivating stories, remarkable achievements, and unique perspectives that shape history and inspire generations. Get ready to embark on a journey through the lives of inspiring people unlike any other.
Hello and welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig Show. My name is Avrum Rosensweig, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. Thank you so much for joining. And the show is all about honoring humankind. That's what I'm doing here. I really want us to take a step back throughout the world, all 8 billion of us, and to say, my God, look what we've created in the last 5,000 years or 6 billion years, whatever your predilection is, because we've done some marvelous things, and I want you to be cognizant of it. That is why I do these interviews. I look for people who are inspiring. And my hope is that the listener, the viewer, will emulate their actions in life and what they have to say. Now, today, I think that we're at the top of the inspiration scale. And because of that, I'm wearing my kippa, my white kippa, my skull cap that I wear on the high holidays. And I put on a jacket in honor of my new dear friend, Carl Wilkins. How are you, Carl?
Hey, I'm good. Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, man. Carl Wilkins in 1994 was stationed in Rwanda as a missionary. He and his family, his lovely wife, Teresa, whom he is still with, thank God, after 43 years, and their 3 children, were there as the genocide was about to break out. What do? Well, the American embassy closed down. Everybody went home. All the sister and brother embassies did the same. Carl stayed. He sent his wife and his 3 children together with his father and his mother to the neighboring Burundi so that they would be safe. And the reason Carl stayed is found in a book that he wrote. A movie was created around it called I'm Not Leaving, but more so in a quote from his wife, Teresa, who said, when Carl sees suffering, he can't run away from it. It's got to run toward it. So with that, let's get going here. Carl, thank you again for doing my show. I'm really grateful.
Always happy to get together and share some of Rwanda's stories and love your theme, man.
How do you feel about yourself? You've done something miraculous. How do you feel about yourself? How do you look at yourself?
It's a cliche to say you're grateful every day, but I honestly am. There's times when I just stop and look, and it's like one of my brothers survived cancer, and he just got a really great report 9 years afterwards. And I see him on the sled with his grandkids, and I'm like, what a gift, almost lost life 9 years ago. And for me, it's 30 years ago that I, went through this hell of an experience. And each day I'm grateful and I think living more intentional, that's definitely a big piece. So I could go on and on with some of your questions, and I appreciate that we have a good chunk of time here. I don't remember if you said it now or earlier. You said you have a good heart, Carl. And it's interesting that that's kind of a journey that I've been on just in the last 6 months is really, well, it's been longer than 6 months, about self-compassion, and really talking to myself like I'd talk to a friend. But also this idea of, recognizing, I do believe I have a good heart, and I believe you do too, and I believe everybody does. And that idea of that heart, getting covered and wounded and bruised, but being part of rediscovering the beauty inside each one of us. Yeah, I could get all philosophical on us here.
The Hutus who stepped into the orphanage of which you were guarding with some fellow workers of yours, they were about to massacre 400 orphans. Did they have a good heart as well?
Okay, I know some of our listeners, this is a brand new story, and I do want to kind of give it as clear a picture as I can. I had showed up with my Rwandan colleague Gasikwa Lize because we were bringing water to this orphanage, and so I never spent a night at that orphanage. And when you say guarding it, all of a sudden pictures come in my mind, and I think of the actual director and his wife and the small staff that they had there and the incredible courage of those people, because nighttime and when things get dark, that's when things often really get scary. But to your question, that's what I've been test driving for since January. The belief that everybody does have a good heart, but that this heart gets covered up, this heart gets twisted. We develop false senses of self. I love what one guy says. He says, you know how you can tell your true self from your false self? He says, if you find yourself self-promoting or self-defending, that's a false self. But a good, pure heart of unconditional love doesn't need to defend. It doesn't need to promote. And that doesn't mean that our actions are always in line with that good heart, so to speak. In fact, often they're not. Mine are not always in line with it. And so for the last since January, since I've been test driving this idea of a good heart in me, a good heart in you, even in people who do horrible things, so there's times it's just not evident. But shame no longer has a place in my thinking when I believe I have a good heart. Guilt does. When my neural pathways and my actions are not in line with this good heart, guilt says, hey, whoa, something's not right here, buddy. And I appreciate that. Me and guilt are on great terms because I need to know. I want to know when I'm out of sync, when I'm out of a line, if I'm doing something that's harming you or harming myself. But shame, that, I'm just barely beginning to dig into the power of shame and the crimes, particularly that men commit. And so I think there's a lot to be explored in that world. And we'll see what other stories we get into. But I had a lady who I met in 2019 in Rwanda who has really not just forgiven, but reconciled. And those are two, they're two very, very different things. With a man who was in the gang who killed her husband and sons. And she knew I was struggling with it. Man, I just was having a hard time seeing this guy as anything but a mass murderer. And her last comment after a most unbelievable story, she just looked me in the eye, and she said, it's wonderful to be part of making somebody beautiful again. And Filbert is beautiful. And I'm like, I'm so inspired by her, and I'm so challenged by her. But she's taken me way beyond. In fact, the word Rwanda, it comes from I just found this out last summer, and I'm kind of like on a campaign to get this word internationalized, used all over the world. But the name Rwanda comes from a verb, quanda. You replace the R with a K, quanda. And when you talk to people in Rwanda, what's quanda mean? It's kind of like it means to expand, but then they're like, no, it's more because you expand and you learn and you grow. And but it's more because you learn and you grow and you connect. And I'm like, quanda. This lady and her journey and her reconciliation, man, it's expanded. I've learned. It makes me want to connect. And so, yeah, it is. I don't want to talk about it like some trite, simple thing. This idea of believing that there's good in everybody, or even as far as saying a good core, a beautiful core in everybody. I can appreciate if somebody's like, no, you don't know what they did to my family. And I'm like, I know a bit of what they did to some families, but I don't know it like they did it. They didn't do it to my family. And so I think it's super important. In fact, it's super important to talk descriptively, not prescriptively. It's almost like when you said I was a missionary, I kind of cringed a little bit. Not that there's not a great history for different missionaries, but there's also some hard horrible stuff connected with that word, and this idea of kind of trying to convince somebody you need to think this way, you need to act that way. And that kind of thinking, that kind of prescriptive approach, man, I want to be far from that. I think the only thing that really changes the way we think and act is, well, your theme, if it's inspiration, if it's, looking for the good, and it's our free choice. It's not by coercion or any kind of pressure or that. So anyway, I'm kind of all over the place, but I have a feeling you're liking this.
Very well said. I do like it. I'm disheveled by nature. Mr. Glenn in grade 3 said, Avrum, do you know what disheveled means? I go, no, sir, I don't. He goes, well, you are disheveled, and you will learn more about it as you go. And I've embraced my dishevelism. I launched a movement called Dishevelism, and I'm the president of it. So if you're
Nice.
all over the place, Carl, so be it. You know what I find fascinating is in 1994, when you were in Rwanda, and prior to that in Zimbabwe, you were working for a Christian organization, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency.
Right.
Yet in all my research of you, listening to some interviews and so on, you barely speak about God.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because there's people who are scared to invite me to their school because they're like, I spent 11 years as a pastor even, and so I think I talk about God all the time. I just don't use that 3-letter word. I grew up with this thing that, this belief, this mantra, this, what's become a cliche for many, God is love. And I'm like, let's talk about love. I mean, people, this beginning of May, I was in Rwanda just a few weeks ago. First time formally speaking at schools in Rwanda. For 20 years, I've been speaking at schools all over the world. And finally, and another story is why it took so long, or, wondering when they would actually be ready, because you're talking to kids whose parents and grandparents were either involved or stood by, or were perpetrators, or, I mean, of course, the kids, you can't say both I mean, they're so young nowadays. If their parents would have been killed, they wouldn't have been born, but they have family connections. And beautiful girls academy, Gashora Girls Academy. Young lady gave this wonderful welcoming speech and everything. She's, we're all wondering, where was God in the genocide? And I'm like, all right, that's where we're going to start this conversation, but I think before we get to that, where was God, I think it would be really productive and useful to kind of lay that 3-letter word aside, because it means so many different things to different people, for just a moment, and let's ask the question, where was love in the genocide? And then they had actually seen the 40-minute film you referred to, I'm Not Leaving, and I asked them, where did you see love in that film? And then they started, whether it was the neighbor ladies who stood in front of our gate and stopped the gang, a killing squad, from attacking our home, whether it was my Rwandan friend who had more than 40 people in his home, and when they came to kill, he greeted the killers with a couple of chickens, offering them some chickens to feed their family, and the list goes on. And so I have, because, just like I said, because the word God means so many different things to different people, and so many horrible things have been done in the name of God, as well as wonderful things. In America, we look at the Underground Railroad, and the role that the Christian community played in that. And there's other places to definitely be proud of. But it seems these days, where we are so polarized all over the planet, that I find it really useful to kind of, let's go to the basics. What's really at the root here of love? And for me, my framework for love is God. But you may have, someone else may have a different framework for love, and it might be nature for them. Shoot, it might be their dog as their framework for unconditional love, and so we can then, I think, talk about something that we hold very dear and close to us, this concept of love, and not be trying to, prescribe or convince people that, our framework is the truth. Or I heard a guy say the other day, I didn't grow up with a worldview. I grew up with the truth. And I'm like, holy cow, yeah.
Annoying folk. Well, let me ask you this. So fair enough. Where was the love of humankind towards others? Where was the love of the Hutus to the Tutsis? That's fair enough. It's a good question that you're asking. But I think the question still stands that those young girls in Rwanda asked you, if God is indeed omnipotent, where was God?
So for me, when you and I want to just kind of right at the beginning here too, a little bit of terminology. There where I really prefer the term Hutu extremist, because there were Hutu people who actually gave their life standing up against the genocide. Now, if there were a lot, it would have been stopped. So it's hard to try to put numbers on that, but it's significant enough that I want to make that point very, very clear. But your question, I love this one. You see, and all loving, all powerful God. When I start the conversation, where is love? Instead of where's God, typically when we're saying where's God, I don't know, my eyes go up, I look to the corner, I look here, where's God, kind of a thing. And when I say where's love, my eyes come to look into your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
They come to look into the mirror in my own eyes. So I bring the conversation internal into a place where I actually can make a difference. Because often we're like, well, come on, God, what are you waiting for, type of a thing. And I think I did grow up with this idea that, the greatest evidence of God are these miracles that no one can explain away, or, anything like that. And I don't doubt miracles at all. But I find much more empowering than, quote, miracles that can't be explained are miracles like those neighbor ladies who stood in front of our house. And so this idea of God also being in control is another part of that, to me, same question. It's like people say, oh, well, it's okay, God's in control. And I'm like, really? Have you been in the middle of a genocide? That doesn't look like very good control to me, And I appreciated what one teacher down in Texas said recently. She said there's a control that influences, and there's more of an authoritarian control that really kind of controls. And she was leaning in the direction, if I understood her right, in the direction of an influential control, which again comes back to love. Because when love starts to become manipulation, or this authoritarian, scripted, got to go this direction type of thing, it loses all the power of love, and it becomes some other authority, some other controlling force that we're probably going to be disappointed in. And so I do believe in a loving and powerful God. I also, though, believe in this idea of a choice, and I hate to. You can tell me I'm kind of stumbling here a little bit, because it's so hard, I think, at times to really wrap your mind around what do you mean a choice, because slaughtering a baby, or grandma, grabbing her out of her bed and brutally assaulting and killing her. How can you call that a choice? And so I don't want to come across kind of like I got this all figured out, because I don't still. But the pathways that I'm walking on are more pathways of influence, pathways that I think empower me and you and everyone to be that love to other people. And I find much encouragement and much inspiration when I start each morning, in a conversation with God. Just being grateful for life, and for grace, and kindness, and breath, and for a vision, and for provisions, and I can go on. I have several things that I often kind of repeat in the morning that are really grounding and give me direction.
Carl, I did a interview with Simone Mamon. She is the wife of Nir Mamon, who is a 47-year-old IDF soldier.
Hmm.
And I've been covering Nir's 3 deployments to Israel since October 7th.
Hmm.
And it's been fascinating because here is an older man in terms of being a soldier, whom his wife Simone qualified as someone who runs toward the danger.
Hmm.
So it's early April 1994, and things are getting out of hand. The president's plane of Rwanda, who was a Tutsi, was shot down, and things started to hit the fan after that. You said to your wife, listen, we have 2 people whom we need to protect. One is Javier, the other is Anita. They worked in your house, a night guardman, and somebody who helped out around the house in the way she could. And you said, I need to stay here and protect them. You said that because you knew that foreigners were respected, and therefore there's a good likelihood they would not kill those 2. I guess what I'm always curious about with folks like you is, what is it about you that was prepared to run toward the danger, and by the same token to put these 2 people forward in your life, knowing that you could be slaughtered, and your wife and 3 kids, just to use a phrase, almost to the side? In other words, were these 2 people more important than your family? Why did you decide to run toward that danger?
Hmm. There was a concern I had that our children would feel like they were somehow less important. And I actually had the conversation this last weekend with my son and his fiance, and and there was no hint ever of that. He assured me, for which I was super grateful, and for which I give his mom a ton of credit for her to be able to, navigate those times as a single mom in effect for those 3 months, and to help the kids not feel like they were somehow second best. Excuse me. I want to go back. You mentioned the president, being his plane being shot down. He was a member of the majority of the Hutu majority, but he wasn't really part of the inner circle who is, well, some would argue about that. So I don't want to get into that, but some thought he wasn't part of the inner circle who was planning the genocide. Others said, yeah, he was. So I don't need to go there. But when that plane is shot down and the killing starts within an hour, um, I can just, as I'm saying that to you, I can just start to feel my chest tighten a little bit. And I've been telling these stories for 30 years. Well, directly, more intentionally, definitely for 20 years. And one of the things that has been a big game changer for me probably 8 years ago is the difference between remembering and reliving. So we can go there if you'd like to a little bit later. But when I just mentioned my chest tightening, I just had to say to myself, Carl, you're reliving this. You're going back there. And most of the time, reliving is not healthy. It's almost like re-traumatizing. So I just kind of throw that little thing in there as I remind myself
Yes.
to remember and not relive and take a breath. But you were moving from a lot of into a lot of what Dan Siegel calls downstairs brain thinking, the amygdala thinking. Okay, and so it's the fight flight type of a part, there on your brain stem, reptilian. And so what you used a word was, was your family less important? That's the best framework I can come up with, is family, for people to really wrap their mind around what my wife and I were deciding and why we decided. The embassy gave us 2 orders. One was to leave, and 2 was not to bring any Rwandans. And this young lady, she didn't just live and work in our home. When somebody loves on your kids, that's like fast track to family. And so it's almost like, I love, there's a kind of a drawing that you would see in that little 40-minute film, a sketch with the young lady on one side of our family and the young man who came as the watchman on the other side of the added in sort of a drawing of a family photo. And it's almost like she was kind of like close immediate family, and he was more like extended family. We didn't know him quite as well or have the bonds, but still he was family. And it's like, that's such an important lens if we're talking about what's going on in the Congo now, if we're talking about what goes on in Israel and Gaza, if we're talking about Ukraine. Can I see family? Because when we can see family, I think it really does change our thinking, our feelings, and our actions. So family is, to me, the most powerful framework to understand why Teresa and I made that decision. It's like part of our family could leave and part of our family couldn't. My mom and dad, you mentioned them earlier, they were there visiting us, which was provided a lot of unique opportunities and to be there at such a horrific time. But I've said to students, I've said, what if my mom would have been out visiting another family that evening and had gotten trapped and then separated? And that was Wednesday night when the plane was shot down. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, almost everybody's gone by Sunday. Nobody would be surprised if I stayed in country still looking for my mother. That would be like, nobody would hardly even question that. And so I understand that when somebody has a different color and a different culture and a different passport, it's kind of a stretch for some of us to really put what we believe, the real meaning of family to that. But that's definitely part of it, part of that decision to stay. Another part, you said I was there risking my life. Yeah, that's true. But there's a certain part of, I think, in a crisis, of optimism, and a certain part of just hope that kind of can lead us to really compartmentalize and kind of be in denial. When I said goodbye to my wife and kids, I said 2 weeks maximum, love. You cannot have 10,000 people, 15,000 people killed every day and the rest of the world do nothing, I wrongly thought. And so I'm like, 2 weeks maximum. They're not using the word genocide. Even if they would have used the word genocide at that point, that wasn't like part of my regular vocabulary. I was a shop teacher. I did whatever required history classes I had to. And that's not to say, I was always interested in the Holocaust. Like, it's interesting. So many students may be like dialed out on much of school, but then you start talking, whether it's Holocaust, whether it's other genocides, and they dial right in. It's interesting how that does grab our attention. And I would have been one of those students too, who, read books, watched films, but the word genocide wasn't part of my vocabulary when the plane was shot down. And so I would put forth that there's a lot of things that you and others who look at it in hindsight knew that my wife and I didn't know when we were making the decision. We didn't know more than 1 million people are going to be killed. We go back and forth. We're not 100% sure if we knew most all of the UN would leave, the 2,500 UN soldiers who were there. So I just kind of like to point out that there were things that we didn't know at that time, which is probably good, when you look back at it. So family, things we didn't know, but then there were things we did know. And you mentioned that, and it bears repeating that, my wife and I had been in Africa, different countries, for 10 years, and we found an incredible kindness and hospitality and generosity extended to us again and again. You would have to live with us. When our first daughter was born in Zimbabwe, and the local ladies came and gave her a local name. That's just one tiny little thing, but there were so many life experiences we had. It's one thing to say, yes, they were kind to foreigners or something. It's another thing to live through that day after day, to see the patience of the people towards foreigners. I was working at a hospital in Zambia, a remote location there, and the guys, I was doing maintenance, and purchasing for the hospital. And my Zambian friends were, oh, you should have seen this German doctor who used to work here. He used to throw hammers at us. And I'm like, what? And they're laughing about it, and I'm like, the grace that was extended to foreigners and things, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to live it. And those lived experiences, they kind of get embedded in our brain, in our neural pathways, and they do impact our choices hopefully in positive ways. And it could be a story I read as a kid, the story of Esther, for such a time as this, a Bible story. All of those things are having impacts on our thinking when we're making these kind of hard decisions. We had a neighbor lady whose husband, when I was a little kid, would drink and then get drunk, and she would get violent, and she would come to our house. I might wake up in the middle of the night and I hear crying, and I come out, in my pajamas, rub at my eyes, and there's the neighbor lady in the kitchen, and mom and dad talking with her. And mom's like, "It's okay, Carl, go back to bed." But that's making impressions. Our house, a place for people to come. You can make a difference. Those kinds of things are all really important, and I think valuable to explore too when we're making decisions that are in some cases life and death. Where does that come from? Because it's one thing to say, well, that just felt right, but why did it feel right? And what like I think I said to you earlier, I've been so loved in my life, and being loved so often, that's a privilege in so many ways. And that's part of I think our kind of our social emotional DNA.
Carl, you mentioned in the movie that before your wife and three children with your parents left Rwanda on a long drive to Burundi, that you were holding your wife in your bedroom looking out the window over the capital. And you turned to her, as you would many times later on the radio, and you said to her, "Are you okay with this decision?" And she said to you, "Absolutely, I am." And would tell
Uh-huh.
you that over and over every single morning when you talked to her on the radio, and every single night throughout the genocide, she not knowing whether you would come back alive. Well, what is Teresa like?
Love it, love it. When we got back together at the end of the genocide in Nairobi, and we were in bed that night, and holding each other, and she says, "Whoa, you lost weight." And I'm like, "Yeah." But I got a question for
And
you.
by the way, your daughter told you as soon as she saw you, "Dad, you
Yeah,
need a haircut."
you need a haircut.
Yeah.
All those practical things. Um, but I said, I gotta ask you, now that I got you in my arms, were you always so rock solid about this decision? And she's like, "No." And so you ask, who's my wife? My wife is a very real, you know, practical, and yet also romantic. I mean, I'm wondering about the word idealist, because I had somebody tell me the other day, you're an idealist. And I'm like, really? And um, she though, she lost her dad in a small plane crash when she was 3 years old. Her mom had 4 kids, 5 years down to 6 months. So life started out not with a lot of the privilege I had. It was hard, and there were other parts of her growing up years that were tough. And I often, I don't say often, it's when people start asking me questions like you just did, that I, start searching too. Where does it come from? I mean, I have a huge respect for her mother, my mother-in-law, really amazing woman. And I know that Teresa got a lot of who she is from her mom. Um, but Teresa is someone who, no job is too dirty or too menial or anything for her. When we would take kids on service learning trips down to Mexico, and there needed to be some cleanup here or something going on there, Teresa's always right in the middle of it. And I'm like, that's just one of the things I love about you, is there's no job that you're afraid of getting your hands dirty on or anything. And you have a heart for people. It's a sensitivity and empathy that is just very, to me, is very inspiring. um, Very unassuming too. She is an incredible pianist. I mean, like very few in the world, I would say. Of course, I'm biased, but I still would say it. um, and yet very unassuming when she plays, and people like, whoa, there's no uh any humility is real. It's evident there, and so very, very unassuming. Funny. Oh my goodness, sometimes most people don't know. I'm one of the few people who knows how funny she is.
Mhm.
Um,
She makes you
it's
laugh.
interesting. It's interesting too. I don't know. It took me so long. It's like really smart people don't let you know how smart they are. And one day I'm like, Carl, you have no idea how much smarter she is than you. And I'm like, that's true.
That's
What
great.
am I? She's a quieter person, a behind the scenes person, who likes it, she says, being there behind the scenes. And sometimes we'll be talking about stuff, and I'm like, you never said anything like that before. And she's like, well, you didn't ask me. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I gotta ask. And so yeah, I could go on and on, but she is, we met, when she was 16, yeah, a junior in high school. And I think back on that. I look at that 16-year-old face, and I look into her eyes today, and she's a person who's interested in growing, and in serving and in loving, and I'm a very fortunate man.
Do you feel like you're good enough for her?
You know, I I'm moving away from, I think, those kinds of comparisons, and I used to hear them, and think, oh yeah, right, and stuff like that. And I think, I'm trying to talk to myself as a friend. There would be times, on obviously, I'd say, oh no, not, or that kind of thing. But with this idea that I've been test driving, I think I'm so grateful that both of our hearts came together. And I definitely think I'm a better person because of her.
Carl, some of the stories that came out of your stay in Rwanda during the genocide have to do with kids.
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, you saved over 400 children in an orphanage because of the actions that you took, because of the fact that you're a white guy, because of the fact that you're a foreigner. The thugs stayed back. But there's some really weird shit that went down when you were there. And you said in the movie once, not a lot here is making sense. One story that you tell is that you went to the government building to try to get help for those orphans, and you happened to bump into the extremist prime minister whom they had put in place. Tell us about that story.
Excuse me. Um, yeah. Um, that, I was, one of the kids in that orphanage. I was reunited with her in Canada some years ago, and a reporter said, "What's it like to be with somebody who saved her life?" And she was, the reporter was looking for a little nice little, snippet, a little sound bite, and she had so much wisdom. She said, I'm so grateful for the day that he was there, and none of us were killed. That was one day in the genocide, and there were other people on other days. And she wasn't trying to diminish that at all. I think she was, that day she wasn't trying to diminish it all. She was trying to help people understand how this is not only a day by day survival, moment by moment, and there were many people who stayed, who were involved in taking an action, during a 5-minute segment, or, even a 1-minute segment, and lives were saved. And so I think it is important to keep that picture in mind, both to keep our head in its proper size, but also to recognize we're part of this shared humanity, part of this movement of love. Um, and it's interesting, that day when we were surrounded by those 50 guys, and I ended up going to the colonel's office. I had, after 3 weeks, when the genocide had been going on for 3 weeks, and we were stuck in our home by order of the government, 24/7 curfew. I said to the pastor who was with me in my home, I said, look, there's got to be more. We got to be able to do more. And he says, well, you're not, outside of our little yard, our little group of people in the house. And he said, well, if you're going to do anything outside, you got to build a relationship with the people in power, which is a really interesting idea. I mean, I think you could write a whole book on what that actually means. But I did begin to build relationships with people who were committing genocide. And sometimes people come up and they ask those questions, well, is that ethical and things like that? Are you somehow condoning it? And I'm like, no, of course we're not condoning it, but we're trying to survive. We're trying to keep people alive. And I really appreciate in Samantha Power's book, Chasing the Flame, Sergio Sergio, a UN a guy. I should quit slaughtering his last name, get it right. But he's working with repatriation of refugees in Cambodia, and the Khmer Rouge, who committed genocide, is still in power in part of the country. And he's officially not supposed to go. They're like, no, we don't recognize them. You can't go deal with them. And he's like, look, our people are going to move back into that part of the country, whether we deal with them or not. We got to facilitate their safe return home. And he makes this statement. He says they would be brought to justice, but today wasn't that day. And so keeping that bigger view too, that this is, today isn't the only part of the story. The story will continue to be written, and I will work to whatever I can to bring them to justice. But today they've got power, and we are trying to build relationships to save lives. And I went back to that colonel's office that day, knowing he wasn't there, and the prime minister happened to be there. And this secretary in the office, I explained, we're surrounded at the orphanage. Some police have showed up. I've left them in the care of some police, but I don't even know if those police will hold back the killers, or if they'll join in with the guys who are killing. It's a horror, what might even be there now or not. And she says, well, you should ask the prime minister, which is like crazy, because I had the idea of building a relationship with people in power, but not that level, and I love the part of that story of this. In fact, in the film, there's drawings, as you saw in the film, and I'm so grateful to the artist, because so many of these things we have no photos of, and you try to explain it, verbally. But I love the drawing of this secretary who is kind of, I think she has her hand out, and she's telling me the prime minister, she asked the prime minister, and that guy will stop the massacre. I think there's other reasons why he will do that. But oh man, I got so lost in my story. What was your question?
So she tells you, go ask the prime minister for help.
Yeah.
For those orphans.
Yeah. And my best, well, and this is worth taking a minute too. My best guess as to why, I don't think he did it out of any kindness of his heart, or any soft spot for children or anything. I think it was a really strategic move on his part. This is the end of June, okay? So the genocide has been going on all of April, all of May. We're now into June, and the French government has sent soldiers to Rwanda in what they call Operation Turquoise, which was supposed to be setting up safe havens for the Tutsi people who were being targeted, and the minority group. And there'll be evidence after evidence that was not their main goal, and there'll be times when they'll even collect people and then abandon them to be slaughtered. So it's a horrible story when in reality, when it plays out. But the theory was what the Canadian general in charge of the UN, General Dallaire, he wanted to have these safe havens set up around the country. But what they were doing there was they were trying to prop up the genocidal government. And once again, we've got a government doing things that I think many of its citizens would have been against. But there was a fear of losing another French-speaking country. And I know that sounds too simplistic to just say, really, you're going to support a genocide because you're afraid of losing a French-speaking country. But that could be unpacked if we chose to. But I think what the prime minister wanted was he wanted to get those soldiers from the western part of the country to the center of the country where the capital was, to prop up his failing genocidal government. When the plane is shot down, they launch a coup. First item of business for the coup government is genocide. And so the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was made up mostly of Tutsi refugees who had fled the country with their parents or had been born outside the country at the time of independence around 62, couple of years ahead of independence. A lot of people were fleeing. They had come back in 1990, and there had been a 3-year war that had eventually led to a peace accord that was going to let refugees come home and kind of really build a well-represented government in Rwanda, everybody having representation, but the extremists were like, no, 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 we will derail that peace process and we will exterminate all of these Tutsis. Their line was, we should have killed them all at the time of independence. Now we will not spare anyone. And so that genocidal government is fighting these refugee soldiers led by then General Paul Kagame, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and they will drive them slowly, well, by some standards, not slowly, 3 months. By other standards, people who are dying and hiding in a well on a 2x4, it's like forever. But they will drive the extremists out of power and out of the country. And then, it'll be the job of reestablishing peace and a new government. So I think it was the prime minister's hope to use these kids as a justification, a kind of like a photo op. See, we have these children here. These French soldiers are protecting them. That's why they're here in the capital. But in reality, they would have been there to try to, like I said, prop up the genocidal government.
You rely on God. You have faith and hope in yourself. You okay?
Yeah, no, let me just
have a sip.
Yeah, a little tickle. Sorry, there. You said, do I rely on God?
You rely on God in life. You're a godly man. You rely on yourself. I see you take a lot of responsibility in life. Are you able to rely on our leadership anymore in the world, in your country?
Oh man, I'd love to just go off on the rabbit hole of what it means to rely on God, but I'll hold off on that for just a moment. Because you've already heard me talk about, I think God works more through the choices of people than through some miraculous, not that I'm saying miracles don't happen, but I like your question here because it does challenge me, because for years I was angry at the American government for their failure, their role in the UN Security Council and voting to take these 2,500 UN soldiers out. They could have stopped the genocide. The genocide could have stopped. And I hold everybody on the Security Council responsible. I hold Kofi Annan, who was in charge of the peacekeeping forces, hugely responsible, for these actions. And I mean, the responsibility, that's a whole conversation that should even go right down to local community leaders and ordinary people. So it's not just foreign governments. But I was also angry, not just at my own government, but I was angry at the UN. And honestly, after a couple decades of anger, it wasn't making any difference. It wasn't improving the UN. It wasn't improving my government. It was just tearing, I think, me down and making me less efficient. Less effective. Like my more downstairs brain thinking, I say downstairs, upstairs brain, prefrontal cortex, empathy, logic, creativity and stuff like that. When we're angry and frustrated, we're down in this fight flight mode here a lot more. And so I have gotten to a place, I think, of and I want to qualify when I use the word forgive. I'm basically talking about getting free from anger and bitterness. I'm not talking about, pardon or even reconciliation, rebuilding a relationship. Those can come later. I'm not talking about if people are sorry or if they deserve it. That's all stuff for reconciliation. I'm just talking about getting free of my own anger and bitterness. And I think I am well along that journey towards the UN and towards my government. And one of the things that helped is meeting individuals in Washington, D.C., especially 20-somethings, 30-somethings working in D.C. I'm like, man, I'm sorry for putting you all in the same, basket of just a bunch of selfish, self-serving, manipulative. I could go on with the adjectives, but I think it's really important. I know this isn't like a typical nasty word or anything, but The idea that somebody is so adversarial, that's just super important for me to look at. And it was brought into, really brought into the spotlight when I was listening to an interview quite a few years ago. Louise Mushikiwabo was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Rwanda at that time. And she said, Rwanda, the culture of Rwanda is a more consensual culture. We have a more consensual version of politics. And I'm like, what? How can you have politics that are consensual? It really challenged me. Kwanda, again, kind of blows my mind. But to come back to your question, I used to put a lot more faith and felt like a lot more dependent on world leaders, presidents and people like that. And they still obviously play an enormously important role. But it's like I'm not going to put all my eggs in that basket, because it's so frustrating. It is so frustrating. And so one of the things that's challenging me right now with politics and how polarized they are is to really be able to see the other side, to try to understand. I've tried to get this quote, and I know it's from Eleanor Roosevelt, but I don't have the exact quote to kind of get the context or anything. But the idea is, if I can't argue the other side's position as effectively as they can, and I know this is an extreme, but stick with me, I have more listening that needs to happen. And so obviously there can be a missing passion or just a core belief that, is going to be missing if I'm arguing their side. But the point is well made, I think, that I need to really spend more time listening to try to understand. Listening, not just necessarily to fix, but listening to understand. Those are some of the things that my frustration in politics now are challenging me to do. Try to listen to understand, try to find something good. If I only define people by one thing, I'm going to be blinded. And there's people who do one things that are horrible, like, you alluded to early on in terms of the Hutus and the Hutu extremists at the time of the genocide. I mean, I know what it is to define somebody by one thing and to struggle against that prison that puts you in. I love Brian Stevenson, works with people wrongfully accused on death row, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. Yeah. And I love this quote he has that says, we're more than the worst thing we have done. And I need to apply that to leaders. I need to apply that to organizations like the UN, defining it from my perspective, from its failure in Rwanda. I need to apply that idea. We're more than the worst thing we've done, much more broadly, and not necessarily because people deserve it, although who am I to judge whether they deserve it or not? But for me, for my mental health and for my ability to try to build peace, to break the cycle of violence. Lately, I've been saying it's really hard for an angry person to break the cycles of violence. And so for me to get free from my anger is important. And one of my kind of favorite tools in my toolbox to get free from anger is to look beyond that one thing, not excusing it, not minimizing it, but recognizing that we are all more than one thing. And that also can give me hope.
I've often thought about Wayne Gretzky. You're a true blue American. You know Wayne Gretzky, right? The hockey player.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Carl Wilkins, come on. You're talking to a Canadian here, but I figure he went down to the States. You would know who he is. Anyways,
I do know the name. I would have gotten it on multiple choice and hockey, but I'm sorry. I don't have a lot.
All right. C then is Wayne Gretzky. He is the best hockey player who ever lived.
Okay.
And when he retired in 1999, I felt that things went down for him. Why? Because he achieved magnificence from the time he was a little kid up until his very last day, playing for the New York Rangers. And after that, he just didn't look great for many years. He seems to have got his footing since then. When the genocide was over and you had done what you had done, save the orphans, save those two people living in your house, brought a presence of goodness and righteousness to this country that was really in the bowels of evil. You go back to your wife and kid. What happens to you the next day? What happens to you the next month, the next year? How do you get your footing from there?
Yeah, good. Good. Because it is one thing to survive. It's another thing to then. And I mean, I don't put myself in the category of survivors of like the Tutsi minority who was targeted. But of course, I did survive different things. Um, where do I go with this one? Definitely professional counseling. You know, I remember sitting at the computer screen and looking at PTSD and a checklist and going, holy cow, you know, I didn't realize. And then I had this stigma, and it took me a long time to get over that stigma about going and getting professional help. And so that's definitely part of that journey afterwards. Journaling. 1998, 4 years after the genocide, is when I started journaling, and I've been doing it ever since. And that's been a massive help for me. I always compare it to like cleaning the windshield. You know, you get clarity, you can focus, because sometimes you're just feeling lousy and you're like, what is going on? Or I'm feeling super critical. What's going on? And this whole question of what's going on, both has been valuable for me. Journaling, understanding that there is such a thing as subconscious beliefs, that, you know, our brain's job is to keep us alive. So it's gathering information, organizing and storing it so it can retrieve it, keep us alive. A lot of that happens while you sleep. And so the idea that it's, you know, the movie I just watched, the book I read, the news article, the conversation I had, the memory I have from 30 years ago, all of these things trying to connect and to make the pieces fit, you know, and connect the dots in your brain. And you form these subconscious beliefs. Like one subconscious belief I had when I was struggling so much, I mentioned early on about meeting a lady who not only forgave, but reconciled with the guy who was in the gang who killed her husband and sons. One of the things that helped me get free from my anger and bitterness towards this guy was recognizing a subconscious belief I had. You see, she was saying stuff positive about him, how he comes and he helps me plant and harvest. And in my mind, I'm like, yeah, well, that's the least he could do. And she's like, you know, he does things for me like my sons would have done if they were alive. And in my mind, I'm saying, yeah, well, if he wouldn't have killed them, they would be here, you know. And he comes and he apologizes multiple times. I'm like, okay, apologize once is fine, now get out. And later I'm saying to myself, why, Carl, are you diminishing or pushing back on everything positive she says about this guy? And it's only in my journaling that I realized I had a subconscious belief that if you say something positive about somebody who's done something horrible, you're diminishing the seriousness of their crime or their accountability. And that's not true. But when you don't know it, that subconscious belief is still there, influencing your thinking. And so, you know, journaling and counseling and just, you know, podcast and learning, like I said, Dan Siegel, upstairs brain, downstairs, how does our brain work, you know, social emotional intelligence, those things, even the idea of grounding and centering and being present, all of those things, they come together in this. For me, sometimes it's like I'm drowning in the horror of what happened and trying to understand, because, you know, I finally put together, I think, a story that makes sense and maybe can communicate some hope to people. And I'm sharing those stories. And then I hear another horrific story of what happened, or a failure of the community court system that I've been really proud of in Rwanda, and a massive failure in one family's story. And I'm like, and you're like, you're drowning again, and you're reaching up to try to find hope, to try to find something to hang on to. And so understanding how the brain works, and like I said, counseling and journaling. One other thing that has been a massive help for me after this, because the question is often, can people change? Can you trust them? I mean, you know, can somebody go from a kind, generous person to a murderer, and can they then become a kind, generous person again, you know, a more trusted neighbor than they were before, you know? And And I'm like, well, I think so. And yeah, there's evidence and stuff. Then I learn about neuroplasticity and
Mhm.
how we can rewire our brain. And this lovely phrase, fire to rewire. We know every time we fired a pathway, about 7 times 7 is 49, 9 times 9 is 81, that we were building new neural pathways. Well, same idea when you're looking for the good in somebody, when you recognize the whole idea of how the brain works, how subconscious beliefs work and stuff. You can be intentional about rewiring your brain. People's brains were rewired to commit genocide,
Mm.
and we don't doubt that. That they did it. The evidence is right there. But the other side is where we often struggle, which is where your question started out. The other side of these horrible things, and so when I realized, for example, this lady who I said had forgiven and reconciled, her name's Maria, and the guy's name is Filbert. They didn't want to have anything to do with each other when he got out of prison. Totally understandable. That all makes sense. Like, more distance, the better. But she wanted something worse than staying far away from him. She wanted to know where her husband and sons were buried. She
Mm.
says that was the turning point between her and him. Now, still, that blows my mind because I'm, again, like, that's the least he could do. But Maria, and this is a story that happens, I met him 25 years after the genocide. I don't know if they met up when he got out of prison 10 years earlier, 15, I don't know how long, but it was a long journey. And I would put forth that she had neural pathways at the beginning that were like anger, confusion, bitterness, loneliness. But when she found out, he helped her find out where her husband and sons were buried, she started building a whole new network of pathways about this man. Excuse me. Maybe pathways of gratitude. She found out when he was in prison, considering confessing, that other prisoners threatened to kill him, and he knew what they were capable of, huh? And he still confessed. And maybe she developed a pathway of respect over here on the other side. Maybe all those times he kept coming to her and apologizing. Maybe there was a day when she said, Filbert, you don't have to keep apologizing. Some empathy began to enter in. I know in different ways empathy had entered in there. And so my kind of little science framework for can people change neuroplasticity is these old pathways of anger and bitterness are not fired as much as new pathways are. And when the brain, it's all about efficiency and, keeping us alive. So it's got this NGF, nerve growth factor. It's like a brain glue, not in abundant supply. So it's got new pathways that it's building. It's like, hey, anybody not using your NGF? Excuse me, because she seems pretty serious about finding the good in this guy. And in theory, these old pathways of anger and bitterness, you could take the NGF from them to the new ones. And this is part of what they call pruning. This is just this whole ability we have to rewire our brain. Neuroplasticity gave me a framework for hope. And I think that's often what we need. Hope it's not like you need a ton of hope. It's like a little molecule of hope can do so much when we can get it. A little molecule of hope and a little framework of neuroplasticity. And man, we're grabbing onto it like, hey, this is something that can help me in my healing and help me in this work of breaking the cycle of violence.
Carl Wilkins, Tully Nates, who is a mutual friend of ours, she is the founder of the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Johannesburg. She introduced us, and I'm really honored that she did. And
No,
that,
me too. She's amazing.
oh, she's an outstanding human being. She tells a story that she went back to Rwanda for the purpose of the program there of reconciliation.
Yeah.
And she's sitting in a circle. And next to her is a fellow who had committed a massacre in a nearby village. Well, nature called. She had to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And the bathroom, it seems, was about 1 kilometer away. He said, I'll take you.
Yeah.
Don't worry. You're in good hands.
I gotcha.
Right? Exactly. And
I love that story.
Right, Carl? And she's sitting there thinking, oh, in good hands.
Yeah.
How am I going to manage this?
Yeah.
He takes her hand and she agrees. They go, they come back. And she turns to him upon sitting down and she says to him, "How did you do that? How did you kill those people?"
Mm.
And his response was, "I was young. I was terrified.
Right.
Everybody was doing it."
Yes.
And he had never done anything like that before, anything afterward. My question to you is, there's sort of alternative forms of justice that are happening in places like Rwanda, snippets of which you talked about and of which Tully talks about. Can we say that Rwanda then is a silver lining, or has a silver lining for the world in which we live, which is not so forgiving?
Excuse me. Rwanda definitely has things to teach us. Um, I struggle a bit with silver linings because and this is maybe not a subconscious belief. Maybe this is a conscious belief. I'm going to have to examine it a little more. But I, I, something inside of me rebels against connecting anything positive with the genocide, and so there's still something there, I'm sure, to explore deeper. But Rwanda, oh my goodness. Rwanda, I mean, you take that one story, and I love that story in the interview you did, and that was my first time to hear her tell that story. These little daily experiences are so powerful in both in directions of rewiring to harm or in directions of rewiring to heal. And so it's a privilege to be living in this country day after day, week after week, having those opportunities. And that was the government's goal, and still is the government's goal in Rwanda, is to provide safety and security and environment, and even at times jobs, like we're going to build each other homes and stuff like that. Every month they have something called Umuganda, where the community all comes out together and they work together. Shared experiences, ordinary, mundane as they might be, those shared experiences are, I would say, crucial to the rewiring of our brain, to building new ideas and concepts about the other. So when we can set up an environment and an opportunity for somebody to have a shared environment, kind of out, it's like break the pattern. Sometimes in relationship that have gone bad, you might say, we need to break the pattern. And to break the pattern sometimes takes something, pretty drastic. I'm not saying genocide, but I'm talking about it's pretty drastic to allow somebody to move from a punitive system of judgment, of justice, which they said in Rwanda, this punitive system will never handle these 300, 400,000 perpetrators who are accused of genocide. And we can't just do nothing. I mean, the rest of the world said we have no choice at the time of the Holocaust, Cambodia, former Yugoslavia. It's like the ordinary people, we can't prosecute. There's way too many. It costs too much. We don't have enough resources, or we don't have time. It would take 100 years. Rwanda said, look, ordinary people were empowered to do genocide. Ordinary people can be empowered to heal this process. So they'll set up more than 12,000 community courts known as gacaca around the country. And while unless, I'm sure we've probably already gone over our time, but we can maybe dig into that on another time. But those community courts were, I hold up this hand to represent punitive justice. This hand is restorative. And this restorative justice is not transactional like what we know. We try to fit the punishment with the crime. There's no fit for genocide, no punishment that is fit for that crime. And rarely does the transactional punitive model break the cycle of violence. So Rwanda adapted something they've been doing for hundreds of years called gacaca, which is a restorative model built on safety in the community. We're going to unpack the harm that was done here. It's not about blame and punish and justice. It's about understanding the harm, repairing the harm, and breaking the cycles of violence, healing at the top. And so when I was talking about something radical earlier to change the pattern, the typical pattern is who's to blame and we punish them. That doesn't often break the cycle of violence. If we try to understand the harm not only that was committed, but the harm that happened to the perpetrator before they committed, and we can go afterwards too. And so understanding the harm is a big, almost endless task. It might be seen that way, but then to repair the harm. And people went out and worked in the community, do not pay back. And I think it's super important to understand, we're not talking transactional. We are not paying back. You cannot pay back. We're given an opportunity to reinvent yourself. When that man walked Tali off to the loose somewhere, he was going through a process of reinventing himself in her mind. That experience, that opportunity to reinvent yourself is what I think is at the core of restorative justice, of breaking the cycle of violence. So when a kid says, wait a minute, you're telling me that people who did genocide go build roads or radical terrorist, agriculture projects that build homes, that's like, a slap on the wrist. And I'm like, yeah, I totally hear you. It isn't fair. That's a transactional model that we're working on fairness. This transformative, we're believing that people can change. And there's going to be stuff that's not fair about this. And that becomes a great question to then unpack. What would get me to buy into something that's not fair, to give up my right to something that's fair, to buy into something that's not fair? Breaking the cycle of violence. You asked me earlier, do I have grandkids? I'm like, I'll do whatever for my grandkids. So letting go of that right to a fair trial and entering into a system that provides an opportunity for people to reinvent themselves, not pay back. That's some of the golden power, the phenomenal challenges that Rwanda presents to us, not just on a justice scale, for courts and things like that, but how do I run my business? How do I run my school? How do I behave in my relationship? I'm asking myself the question a lot lately. When is transactional thinking, which is important, we need to stop at a red light, when is transactional thinking, though, robbing me of transformative experiences? So I'm really looking, even like an Uber driver the other day, I'm like, this is a nice car and it probably doesn't get good gas mileage. And I didn't criticize him, but I said, interesting choice. He says, I spend a lot of time in this vehicle and my clients do too. I think it should be nice. And I'm like, that's transformative thinking. That's not transactional.
I love the way you think, Carl. And I love the way you speak. I have to ask, I have to Canadianize this interview a little bit. When you left Rwanda, you left on a C-130 Canadian cargo plane.
Yes.
There are very few righteous people in the world who attempt to do what you do, at least of whom we know. We know that there were righteous Gentiles in Europe during the Holocaust, a few hundred of whom are honored at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, but there's only a few hundred. Romeo Dallaire was a general in Rwanda. He was a very brave man. He stayed there. He wrote about it later, shaking hands with the devil. What is it called?
Yeah, Shake Hands with the Devil.
Shake Hands with the Devil. I have the book right here. When you see Romeo Dallaire or a Romeo Dallaire, do you look at each other and just sort of nod and go, yeah, I get it?
Well, I got to tell you, just kind of chills when you mention that C-130. It was the Canadian military. And last week, it was last week. The week before last, I was in Kelowna, BC, speaking at high schools. And it hit me like a beautiful ton of bricks. I'm usually speaking to students who are largely in America, which I, hold our government responsible for failures in Rwanda. Not today. Here in Kelowna, BC, I'm talking to kids who can be proud of the heritage of Canadian UN soldiers who volunteered to stay at the risk of their life on a humanitarian mission. You know, that the observing mission was abandoned, and General Dallaire, along with the support of his colleague, his assistant Henry Adiaho from Senegal, I believe. You know, I love in the line in the movie, the documentary Ghost of Rwanda. General Dallaire comes into Henry Adiaho's office and he says, "Henry, New York says we failed." And Henry's like, "No, we have not failed." And you know, he's like, "We will not leave. We will do." I got to get his line. I should go back and find that because it was so good. We're going to do what good leaders should do, something like that, you know, and we're going to stay. And so I love the fact that, no, it's not just Canadians who are kind of there, but Canadians are a shining light right alongside West Africans and also people from Bangladesh and other UN soldiers. And I love that image of, we have something to be proud of in these men who stayed during that time. And they were an enormous inspiration to me. I talked on the radio almost daily with Mama Papa Zero. Mama Papa Zero was the call number for the Humanitarian that was often manned by the Canadian soldiers there. And of course, you met Phil Lancaster in the 40-minute film. But your question about General Dallaire, I have, yeah, huge respect and appreciation. It was February. BBC was doing an interview program, and they had both of us actually on there. So we had 10 minutes before it started, fortunately, and we're just chatting on Zoom. And it was so nice to visit with him and to see where he has taken his life, how he has, well, the tragedy of trying to end his life. You know, I can never begin to comprehend the position he was in, knowing that he had enough forces to stop the genocide, but he was not able, one way or another, to convince New York to equip those courageous men who were there, and to stop that genocide. It's horrific to think of the position he was in, and I am so glad. And he speaks so openly about professional help, about medication, about all kinds of tools that are available for us in the healing journey, and the work he does now, whether it's supporting families who are you know, have family members serving overseas, or, you know, against child soldiers. And I'm just a big fan of his. In fact, I love, you know, because I often will drive up. We're here in Spokane, so I drove up to Kelowna, and as I'm going through the little border post, it was actually, I picked a little remote one, but even there, they know, you know, General Dallaire, what are you doing? I'm coming here to speak. We speak about the Rwandan genocide, and I love that part about the Canadian community, and it's a real privilege to get up there and share stories and to hear from them and that. So I'm glad you brought that in. It's it was just it's a moment that takes me back and really begins to give me a lump in my throat when I think about being strapped in the side of that C-130 as we left Rwanda and being reunited with my family. Yeah, glad you brought it up.
I notice you take really good care of yourself. You have beautiful skin, and I know your manicured fingers. Is that all part? Is that all part of growing and growth and health?
No, I never even.
No, you do. You have manicured fingers. I don't.
No, I chew my nails sometimes. Anyway,
yeah, they look manicured. But you have nice tan. You seem to take good care of yourself. Am I correct?
I have my grandma from Jamaica to thank for that.
Okay, there you
go. But no, it is important, definitely. And I think that's part of this other thing, you know, both physically and emotionally, spiritually, to recognize, you know, for example, when I say I have a good heart, I believe that's a gift for me. I believe that's a gift from God, that God gives to everybody that gift. And so it's not like, whoa, look at me, I got a good heart. It's like, no, wow, I've been given this body, I've been given this heart. And in other situations, I've been given this opportunity. And so those gifts are something that I am very, very grateful for. And when I first started speaking at schools, it really started when the documentary Ghost of Rwanda came out, PBS Frontline, together with the BBC in 2004. I think it's still available on YouTube. I know it's still available on the websites, but teachers started asking, me if I would come speak at their schools. And I was grateful for those opportunities. But I think I probably would have burned out a long time ago, because that was the time of the genocide in Darfur and so many other crises that have happened and are still ongoing there. I think it is really important to, for me, it might be kind of simplistic, the idea of a scale and things like that. But if I am more consumed with the injustice and the harm and the atrocities in the world, if I'm more consumed with that than the beauty and the good and the kindness and compassion. And I know that sounds kind of simplistic. How do you put them on the scale? But the other day I had a chance to stop by the Oregon coast, the beach, for just under an hour. It wasn't long, but I was out there on the beach, and then I'm like, no, I'm not going to be here without taking my shoes off and getting in the Pacific, and running in the water, and just this opportunity, seizing opportunities, whether it is a sunset, whether it is, just cracked up. My grandson the other day, he knocked over the water bottle of the friend at the playground, and his mom says, "Pick that up, buddy. You need to pick it up for your friend." And he's like, called him Kai, and he's like, "No, my name's not Kai." And she's like, "What? Oh, my name's Chase." Well, Chase is a Paw Patrol character and a cartoon character. And she's like, "Okay, Chase, pick up the thing." "Oh no, Chase is a dog who doesn't have hands." And it's like, you just see this little 3-year-old's mind
That's
working and imagining,
Yeah.
and I'm reveling in that. Reveling in the beauty that is around us, reveling in the little moments that are there. That's part of, keeping, I think, my reservoir full on the side of kindness and beauty. And then recognizing too, you can't be the expert on every crisis in the world, or you can't save the world, but we do what we can, what's here in front of us. And we realize we're not alone. I think courage is contagious. And when we look, there are tons of courageous stories out there, courageous people that are doing things, even if it's the guy keeping the bathroom nice and tidy at the airport, wherever you are,
Mhm.
and expressing gratitude for those things. It's really hard, I think, for cynicism and gratitude to coexist. And so, yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff to explore in reveling in the gifts we have in our own mind and body, and in our families and in our community. And I think you let me just go on and on.
Well, I don't quite see that. People say to me, Avrum, the reason why I like your interview is because you let your guests talk. Like, how often am I going to be able to hear Carl
Appreciate it.
Wilkins? How often am I able to hear somebody who rescued and saved hundreds and hundreds of people in a war-torn area as devastating as Rwanda? So I figure, shut up, Avrum, because I know what I'm thinking. I don't have to hear from myself, nor does anybody else. I want to hear from
Good
you.
example. Thank you.
Carl Wilkins, I
Thank
want to
you.
read something from Psalm 3 to wrap
Sure.
up the show. It's a poem. We encourage you to meditate on these verses and pray. This is from a Holocaust website. "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy hill. I lie down and sleep. I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I am not afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Rise up, O Lord, deliver me, O my Lord, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on your people." The reason I read this is because, I am a Jew, and we, the Jewish people, right now are suffering some terrible anti-Semitism. So many, many Jews whom I know rely upon God to watch over us and also make a real effort themselves to play a role in not only fighting anti-Semitism, but making this world more beautiful through love, through friendship, through brotherhood and sisterhood, and through unity. Listening to the interview that we did today, I am so incredibly hopeful about our world and about the citizens of our world. Because I figure if Carl Wilkins can do it, yeah, what the hell? Maybe we can all do it.
Absolutely.
So I say, like in Hebrew, we say kol hakavod, which means all the honor to you, Carl. Yeah, you're a lovely human being. You really are, with a beautiful spirit. And you have kahunas, man. You're so courageous and brave. And I think a lot of people can really emulate that. So I want to thank you so much for being on my show. You were magnificent, really.
Thank you. Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to future conversations. We can just talk on the phone sometime. Doesn't have to be a podcast.
I would love to do that.
Good to meet you, and thanks for what you're doing and bringing stories to people. I mean, we're story animals, huh? Our brains are just love stories anyway, and so that's where it's at. You want it to go home, you wrap it in a story. So thank you for being that kind of storyteller and story listener.
Carl, do you have a song that you sing your grandchildren or that you sing your family about hope, about love, about anything that we discuss? Can you sing a little bit of it for us? I like to end my podcast with my guest singing.
No way.
Yeah, a little bit, Carl.
I love music, but I am not a singer. But okay, well, all right, you asked for it. And this is just kind of fun, and it's fun too because it's got its Jewish roots and stuff. There was a day during the genocide that I was so discouraged, and I hooked up my car battery to my big old desktop computer and had a little inverter so I could power it off of that. And I just typed in a program in the Bible. I typed in a search word in there, discouraged. I didn't want hope. I was just so discouraged. And you know what popped up was Joshua 1:9. And so the song, the kind of fun song is, it's in a minor key. And so it goes like, have I not commanded you be strong and courageous? Have I not commanded you be strong and courageous? Do not be terrified, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you may go. Hey.
Carl Wilkins, thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you.
And I do
nice to be with you.
Yeah, it was lovely, and I look forward to our continued friendship.
You bet.
I would ask our listeners and our viewers, listen very closely to the words of Carl Wilkins and do your very best to emulate them, and try to make this world better in the way that you have the ability to do. You can rock, you can get in the zone, you can make things to shine like the light that we have the potential to shine like. And again, if you take a look at the beautiful things that we've accomplished, it's not hard to find them. So God bless. I look forward to being with you again. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Take care.